Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. And today we're doing a deep dive into one of the most beloved, absolutely iconic films of the 1990s, The Mask, released in 1994. Now, if you haven't seen this movie, first of all, where have you been? Second of all, buckle up, because we're about to walk through everything that makes this film so incredibly special, so endlessly rewatchable, and so genuinely unique in the history of Hollywood comedies. And if you have seen it, well, stick around anyway, because I promise we're going to dig into some details and angles you might not have thought about before. This is going to be a long one, so get comfortable, grab your snacks, and let's get into it. So let's start right at the beginning, with the core premise of the movie, because honestly, even just the basic setup of this film is kind of genius when you think about it. The Mask is built around a deceptively simple idea. What happens when the most timid, overlooked, and underestimated guy in town suddenly gets access to virtually unlimited power? Not superhero power in the traditional sense, not laser beams or flying capes, but something far more chaotic and far more interesting. The power to do absolutely anything, limited only by imagination, with zero consequences and zero inhibitions. The ancient mask that the main character discovers transforms whoever wears it into a living, breathing cartoon character, essentially pulling the wearer's deepest personality traits and most suppressed desires out into the open and amplifying them to an absolutely absurd, physics-defying degree. And that's the hook. That's what makes the whole movie work on multiple levels at once. On the surface, it's a spectacular comedy full of jaw-dropping visual effects and physical humor. But underneath that, it's genuinely exploring something pretty relatable. The idea that most of us have a version of ourselves that we keep locked away. A more confident, more expressive, more fearless self that we don't let out, because society, circumstances, or just plain anxiety keep it bottled up. The Mask just takes that concept and cranks it up to 11 with green face paint and a very loud suit. And that's the beauty of it. Now, the main character at the center of all this is Stanley Ipkiss, played by Jim Carrey, and we'll get into the casting in much more detail later. But for now, let's talk about who Stanley actually is as a character, because he's really the heart of the whole thing. Stanley is a bank teller living in a city called Edge City. He's polite, he's soft-spoken. He's the kind of guy who gets walked all over on a daily basis and somehow still manages to be cheerful about it, or at least to put on a cheerful face. His landlady mistreats him. His car breaks down constantly. His boss barely acknowledges his existence, and his so-called friends take advantage of him without a second thought. He's a pushover in the most complete sense of the word. But here's the thing about Stanley that the movie makes very clear very early on. He's not a bad person. He's not weak-willed in a moral sense. He's just someone who has been conditioned to make himself small, to not take up space, to not demand better treatment. He's got a good heart, a genuinely kind soul, and a deep capacity for joy. He loves jazz music. He has a little dog named Milo who absolutely adores him, and he's capable of real excitement and real enthusiasm when he lets himself feel those things. So when the Mask comes along and strips away all of his inhibitions, what comes out isn't a monster. It's an exaggerated, supercharged version of the good stuff that was always in there, just filtered through the lens of absolute cartoonish chaos. And that's a really important distinction that the film makes, even if it makes it while someone is spinning around like a tornado and pulling impossibly large mallets out of thin air. And speaking of the people around Stanley, let's talk about the supporting cast and the other major characters who populate this world, because The Mask does a genuinely good job of building out a full and lively ensemble around its central premise. One of the most important figures in Stanley's life before the mask even enters the picture is his best friend, Charlie Schumacher, played by Richard Jeni. Charlie is the kind of friend who means well, but is also kind of part of the problem. He's the one encouraging Stanley to go out, to take chances, to live a little, but he's also the one who drags him to nightclubs he doesn't really want to go to and gets him into situations that are just a little bit beyond Stanley's comfort zone. Charlie functions as a comedic foil throughout the film, and Richard Jeni brings a lot of warmth and natural comic timing to the role. He's not the most complex character in the movie, but he doesn't need to be. He serves a clear narrative purpose, and he's genuinely funny in his scenes. Then there's Peggy Brandt, played by Amy Yasbeck, who works as a reporter and starts off seeming like a potential ally for Stanley. She's smart, she's ambitious, and she's got her own story going on that intersects with the main plot in some genuinely interesting ways. The film uses her character to explore some themes around trust and betrayal, and while the screenplay doesn't give her quite as much to do as you might wish, Yasbeck makes the most of every scene she's in. Of course, we absolutely cannot talk about the characters in The Mask without talking about Tina Carlisle, played by Cameron Diaz, in what was essentially her feature film debut, and what a debut it was. Tina is the love interest at the center of the story, but she's so much more than just a love interest. She's a fully realized character with her own arc, her own motivations, and her own moral journey throughout the film. When we first meet Tina, she's walking into the bank where Stanley works, and she's absolutely stunning, and Stanley is immediately completely smitten. But Tina isn't just there to be pretty and to be the object of Stanley's affection. She's also navigating a complicated and dangerous situation with her boyfriend, a crime boss named Dorian Tyrell, and she's trying to figure out how to get herself out of that situation without putting herself at risk. Tina is smart, she's perceptive, and over the course of the film, she develops a genuine connection with Stanley that feels earned rather than just convenient. Cameron Diaz is absolutely magnetic in this role. She has this incredible combination of beauty, charm, warmth, and genuine comedic talent that makes Tina feel like a real person rather than just a plot device. The chemistry between Diaz and Carrey is palpable and real, and it gives the film an emotional core that grounds all the crazy visual spectacle in something human and relatable. It's really worth thinking about what it meant for Diaz's career that her very first major film role was this. She came out of the gate fully formed, completely confident, and absolutely electric on screen. Not bad for a first movie. Now, on the other side of the equation, we've got our villain, and The Mask gives us a pretty solid one in the form of Dorian Tyrell, played by Peter Greene. Dorian is a crime boss who operates out of the Coco Bongo nightclub and who has ambitions that extend well beyond his current criminal enterprise. He's dangerous, he's calculating, and he's got that particular kind of menace that comes from someone who is very intelligent and completely without scruples. Peter Greene plays him with a cold, coiled intensity that provides a nice contrast to the explosive energy of Jim Carrey's performance. Dorian wants to take over the criminal underworld, and when he hears about the mask and its powers, he immediately recognizes an opportunity. His relationship with Tina is possessive and controlling, which gives her character plenty of motivation to want out. Dorian serves the story well as a villain. He's threatening enough to feel like a real danger, but the film is smart enough not to linger too long on the darker aspects of his character, keeping the overall tone squarely in comedy territory. He gets his moments of menace without the film ever tipping into territory that would feel out of place in what is ultimately a fun, family-friendly adventure. And then there's Lieutenant Mitch Kellaway, played wonderfully by Peter Riegert, who is the detective assigned to investigating the increasingly strange reports of someone in a green face doing impossible things around Edge City. Kellaway is the perfect straight man for all the chaos that surrounds him. He's gruff, he's skeptical, he's deeply unimpressed by basically everything, and he becomes increasingly convinced that Stanley Ipkiss is behind all of it. His relentless pursuit of Stanley provides a lot of comic tension throughout the film, and Peter Riegert plays him with a beautifully dry comedic sensibility that makes him genuinely entertaining every single time he's on screen. He's the kind of detective who has probably seen everything at this point, and yet somehow is not at all prepared for what the mask is doing to his city. And honestly, watching him try to process all of it while maintaining his completely deadpan exterior is one of the great comedic pleasures of the whole movie. His scenes with Jim Carrey are particularly great because the contrast between Kellaway's utter immovability and the mask's utter unpredictability creates this wonderful kind of comedic friction. Let's also take a moment to talk about Milo, because honestly, Milo deserves his own section. Milo is Stanley's dog, a little Jack Russell Terrier, and he is absolutely delightful from start to finish. Dogs in movies are always a crowd pleaser, obviously, but Milo in The Mask is genuinely special because the film gives him real things to do. He's not just there to be cute, although he absolutely is cute. He's actually a plot-relevant character who gets to do things and have an impact on the story. There's a particular sequence later in the film where Milo gets hold of the mask himself, and it's one of the best gags in the whole movie. The visual effects work on cartoon Milo are fantastic, and the sheer absurdity of a tiny dog with a green face causing chaos is just perfect. It says a lot about how carefully constructed this film is that even the dog has a satisfying character arc. Now let's get into the production side of things, because The Mask is a genuinely fascinating film from a filmmaking perspective, not just from an entertainment perspective. The movie was directed by Chuck Russell, who had previously worked on things like A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors, and the Blob remake, which might sound like an unusual background for a comedy, but actually makes a lot of sense when you consider how much of The Mask depends on spectacular visual effects and a kind of controlled cinematic chaos. Russell brought a real understanding of how to use the frame dynamically, how to build sequences that escalate properly, and how to let special effects serve the story rather than overwhelm. His direction of The Mask is confident and energetic, and he clearly understood that his main job was to create a playground that Jim Carrey could run wild in. The film moves with tremendous energy and pace. It never drags, it never lingers too long on any single element, and it transitions between its various tones with a fluency that is actually pretty impressive. Going from Stanley's quiet, sad little apartment life to the explosive cartoon chaos of The Mask's nighttime adventures could easily feel jarring. But Russell manages those transitions smoothly, and a big part of that comes down to his visual approach to the material. The screenplay was written by Mike Werb, and it's based on a Dark Horse comic series of the same name, which is a really interesting piece of background that a lot of people don't necessarily know going in. The original comic book version of The Mask, which was published starting in the late 1980s, was actually quite a bit darker and more violent than the film. More of a horror-inflected story about a mask that brings out the worst in whoever wears it, with genuinely disturbing consequences. The film adaptation made the very smart decision to fundamentally shift that premise, keeping the core concept of the transformative mask while completely reimagining what the transformation means and what kind of story it enables. Instead of a horror story, the film becomes a comedy with genuine heart, and instead of a character who becomes monstrous when he puts on the mask, we get a character whose best qualities, his joy, his creativity, his love of music and fun, are amplified to superhuman levels. Mike Werb's screenplay accomplishes this reimagining gracefully, building a script that is funny and fast-paced while also giving its characters enough depth to make us genuinely care about what happens to them. The structure of the screenplay is solid and well-organized, setting up the rules of the Mask's world clearly and then finding creative ways to play with those rules throughout. Now here's something worth dwelling on, because it really speaks to the vision behind this film. The producers made an incredibly bold choice when they cast Jim Carrey in the lead role. And I don't mean bold in hindsight, I mean bold at the time, because The Mask was actually in production more or less simultaneously with Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, and Dumb and Dumber, which means that when The Mask was being made, Jim Carrey was not yet the guaranteed box office phenomenon he would become. He was a performer with enormous talent and a devoted following from his time on In Living Color, but he hadn't yet proven himself as a movie star in the conventional sense. The people making The Mask took a genuine chance on him, and it paid off in the most spectacular possible way. The film was produced by Bob Engelman and Chuck Russell, with Lumen Cinema backing the production, and the fact that they committed to doing the film's extraordinary visual effects work at the scale they did, at a time when CGI was still a relatively new and very expensive tool, shows real confidence in both the material and in Carrey's ability to carry it. The story of how The Mask came together is also pretty interesting from a Hollywood development perspective. The project had been kicking around for a while before it finally got made, and there were various different visions for what it could be and how faithful it should be to the source comic. The decision to essentially reinvent the tonal approach entirely, to make something joyful and comedic and cartoonish rather than dark and disturbing, was a watershed moment in the development process. And it's a decision that looks absolutely correct in retrospect, because the film that resulted is one that has endured and found new audiences across generations in a way that a straight horror adaptation almost certainly would not have. There's something genuinely timeless about the version of the story that ended up on screen, something that connects to a very universal set of feelings and desires that doesn't really date in the way that a lot of 1990s genre films have. Let's talk about the visual effects, because this is one of those movies where the technical achievement is genuinely inseparable from the storytelling achievement. In 1994, what Industrial Light and Magic did with The Mask was absolutely groundbreaking, and it still holds up remarkably well today, which is a testament to how thoughtfully the effects were conceived and executed. The key challenge with The Mask's transformation sequences was to make them feel genuinely cartoonish, not just digitally enhanced, but actually evocative of the classic Looney Tunes and Tex Avery animations that are clearly a massive influence on the film's visual language. The filmmakers and effects artists had to figure out how to take a real human being and make him behave in ways that violate the laws of physics, while still remaining emotionally readable and funny rather than just weird. And they did it brilliantly. Jim Carrey's eyes popping out of his head, his jaw literally dropping to the floor, his heart bouncing out of his chest when he sees Tina for the first time. These are effects that could easily have looked grotesque or uncanny, but instead they look delightful, because they're so perfectly calibrated to the comedic moment they're serving. The key to why the effects work so well is that they're never arbitrary. Every piece of cartoon physics in the film is emotionally motivated, tied to what the mask is feeling or reacting to, which means they read as expressions of character rather than just technical showboating. The transformation sequences themselves, the moments when Stanley actually puts on the mask and becomes the mask, are some of the most spectacular moments in the film, and they feature effects work that was genuinely state-of-the-art at the time. The green morphing of Stanley's face, the way his whole body seems to shift and inflate and reconfigure, the spinning tornado effect, All of it is executed with a confidence and a creativity that makes it feel less like a technical demonstration and more like pure movie magic. And part of why it works so well is because Jim Carrey meets the effects halfway. His physical performance before and after the transformation is so extreme, so committed, so fully cartoonish that the digital effects don't feel like they're adding something foreign to the performance. They feel like they're just continuing it. Now, let's spend some serious time talking about Jim Carrey's performance, because it really is the beating heart of this entire film and deserves a lot of careful attention. Carrey had been developing his comedic style for years before The Mask, honing his extraordinary physical expressiveness through years of stand-up, sketch work, and television. But The Mask gave him a canvas unlike anything he'd had before, a role that literally asked him to be unlimited, to go as far as his imagination and body could take him, and to do it all in service of a character who was genuinely lovable rather than just entertaining. His performance in the film is actually two distinct performances woven together, and the contrast between them is crucial to why the movie works. As Stanley, Carrey dials everything back. His body language is restrained, his voice is softer, his expressions are more muted. He's playing a man who has learned to take up less space, and you can see that restraint in every aspect of how he carries himself. And then, when The Mask takes over, all of that restraint explodes outward in the most spectacular possible way. Every suppressed impulse, every held-back emotion, every bit of energy that Stanley keeps locked down comes out at full volume. The effect is both comedic and kind of cathartic. Watching The Mask let loose feels liberating in a way that goes beyond just finding it funny. Carrey's gift for physical comedy is on extraordinary display throughout the film, but what's really impressive is that he never loses the emotional core of the character, even in the most outrageous moments. Even when The Mask is doing something completely insane, you can trace a line back to Stanley's genuine desires and feelings, and that's what keeps it from being just empty spectacle. There are particular sequences in the film where Carrey's performance reaches an almost transcendent level of creative energy. The nightclub dance sequence is probably the most famous of these, when The Mask arrives at the Coco Bongo and proceeds to turn the whole place upside down with his dancing. It's a masterclass in how physical comedy can be genuinely breathtaking. The choreography, the timing, the sheer joy radiating from every movement, it's the kind of performance that you can't quite believe you're watching, even while it's happening right in front of you. And then there's the interrogation room scene, and the alley sequence, and approximately a dozen other moments scattered throughout the film where Carrey does something so completely unexpected and so precisely executed that it crosses from being funny into being genuinely impressive as a piece of performance art. The Mask gave Jim Carrey the role of a lifetime in many ways, because it asked him to synthesize absolutely everything he was capable of into a single character, and he delivered on that ask in spectacular fashion. Cameron Diaz's performance deserves equal attention and equal praise, because it would have been very easy for Tina Carlisle to be overshadowed by everything Carrey is doing, and yet she never is. Diaz holds her own in every scene she's in, which is no small feat when you're sharing the screen with someone as explosively charismatic as Carrey. Part of what makes her so effective is that she never plays the role as passive. Tina is always thinking, always reacting, always engaged with what's happening around her. When she's with Dorian, you can see her calculating, figuring out her next move. When she's with Stanley, you can see genuine warmth and curiosity developing. And when she's with The Mask, she has to navigate the tricky territory of being impressed and entertained by this impossible creature while also maintaining her own sense of agency. Diaz does all of this effortlessly, which is honestly remarkable for a first major film performance. She also brings an incredible physical presence to the role. The way she carries herself, the way she moves, the way she uses her face, it's all incredibly confident and incredibly effective. The Mask would be a lesser film without Cameron Diaz, full stop. And it's wonderful that it was the film that introduced her to audiences because it showed them immediately that she was someone genuinely special. The chemistry between Carrey and Diaz is one of those things that either works or it doesn't. And in The Mask, it absolutely works. Their scenes together have a warmth and a playfulness that makes the romantic subplot feel genuinely earned rather than just obligatory. The film does something smart in how it handles their relationship. It gives them time as Stanley and Tina before it gives them time as the Mask and Tina, which means that when the mask eventually comes off and the real emotional connection has to be established, the groundwork is already there. You believe that Tina sees past the mask, literally and figuratively, to the person underneath, because the film has taken the time to show you that Stanley is worth seeing past the surface for. And Carrey and Diaz play their quieter Stanley and Tina scenes with a lovely, unforced sweetness that balances the film's more energetic elements beautifully. Now let's talk a bit about the supporting players, because The Mask is really well served by its ensemble, even in the smaller roles. Peter Riegert, as we discussed, is fantastic as Kellaway, and his partner Doyle, played by Jim Doohan, is a great comedic foil, slightly more impressionable and confused than Kellaway, and consistently baffled by the events unfolding around him. The scenes where the two detectives are trying to process the increasingly bizarre evidence they're gathering are consistently funny, and the dynamic between them is a classic straight man and slightly less straight man pairing that works beautifully. Then there's the nightclub singer, and the various gangsters who work for Dorian, and Stanley's terrible roommate, and his awful landlady. The film populates every corner of its world with characters who feel like real people rather than extras, and that gives Edge City a genuine sense of place and life. The world building in The Mask is actually something worth appreciating on its own terms, because the film creates a very specific and very consistent version of reality. Edge City feels like a slightly exaggerated version of a real American city. It has all the recognizable textures of urban life, the nightclubs and the back alleys and the diners and the police stations, but everything is pushed just a degree or two toward the theatrical, the stylized, the slightly larger than life. This is deliberate, and it's smart, because it means that when the Mask's cartoon physics erupt into this world, they feel like an amplification of something that was already a little heightened, rather than a complete rupture with reality. The production design and art direction of the film deserve a lot of credit for this. The visual world that was built for The Mask is consistent and coherent, even as it accommodates things that are genuinely impossible. Now, one of the things that makes The Mask so fascinating to analyze is the way it uses its central fantastical premise to explore some genuinely interesting ideas about identity, authenticity, and what it means to be free. The mask in the film is literally an ancient artifact associated with Loki, the Norse trickster god, and this mythological connection is established early in the film when Stanley researches the mask's origins at the library. And the trickster connection is meaningful, because trickster figures in mythology tend to be agents of chaos who also, ultimately, serve to reveal truth. They strip away pretense and social convention to expose what's really underneath. That's exactly what the mask does for Stanley. It strips away all the social training that has taught him to minimize himself, to be polite and self-effacing, and to never take up space, and reveals, loudly, chaotically, at maximum possible volume, that underneath all of that is someone with enormous capacity for joy, creativity, and love. The mask is, in a very real sense, Stanley's truest self, just running without a filter. And the film is asking a genuinely interesting question with this setup. Is authenticity the same as freedom? Is letting go of all inhibitions actually liberation? Or is there something important about the restraint we choose to maintain? The film doesn't give a simplistic answer to this question, which is one of the reasons it's more interesting than it might appear at first glance. By the end of the story, Stanley doesn't simply embrace everything the mask represents. He also has to choose what to do with it, and that choice is itself a kind of character statement. The fact that the film ultimately affirms that Stanley's real self, the self he is without the mask, is enough, is worthy of love and connection and happiness, is what gives the movie its emotional payoff. It's saying that you don't have to become something superhuman to deserve to be happy. You just have to find the courage to be who you actually are, which is harder and more important than any magical transformation. Let's talk about the film's visual style in more depth, because it's absolutely central to everything the mask does, and it deserves real appreciation. Chuck Russell and his cinematographer made a series of very deliberate choices about how to photograph this story that make it look unlike almost anything else being produced in Hollywood at the time. The film has a very specific color palette, rich, saturated, almost hyper-real in its use of color. The yellows are golden, the reds are deep and warm, the greens are vivid and slightly unnatural even before the mask enters the picture. This heightened color approach is clearly intentional, working in the same direction as the production design to create a world that is recognizably real, but also slightly dreamy, slightly theatrical. It makes perfect visual sense that a cartoon character could erupt into this world, because the visual language of the film has been subtly preparing you for that possibility from the very first frame. The use of lighting throughout the mask is also worth examining. The scenes in Stanley's apartment have a softer, slightly more naturalistic quality, emphasizing his ordinary life and the slightly sad smallness of his world. The nightclub scenes are rich with theatrical, colorful light. The Coco Bongo is always bathed in warm golds and blues and purples, making it feel glamorous and exciting and just slightly unreal. And then the action sequences, particularly those involving the mask in full effect, use a more dynamic, contrast-heavy approach that emphasizes the chaos and energy of what's happening. The lighting shifts serve the storytelling in ways that you might not consciously notice, but that absolutely affect how you experience each scene. It's a very considered, very controlled piece of cinematography, and it does a lot of heavy lifting in establishing and maintaining the film's distinctive atmosphere. The film's pacing is another element that deserves real credit because it's essentially perfect from beginning to end. The opening act establishes Stanley's world and his character efficiently and with genuine warmth. You know exactly who this person is and why you should care about him within the first 15 minutes, which is much better than a lot of films manage. The introduction of the mask is carefully timed to come at exactly the moment when Stanley's situation has reached its lowest point, which means the transformation has maximum impact, both comedically and emotionally. The middle section of the film balances the expansion of the mask's world with the advancement of the various plot threads in a way that maintains momentum without ever feeling rushed. And the final act brings everything together with an escalating series of sequences that build toward a genuinely satisfying and emotionally resonant conclusion. Now let's talk about the music, because the soundtrack of The Mask is genuinely wonderful and contributes enormously to the film's overall effect. The film uses jazz heavily throughout, which makes perfect sense given Stanley's love of the genre, and it creates a musical atmosphere that is both warm and sophisticated, grounded in a particular American tradition of popular music that feels connected to the film's slightly nostalgic, slightly timeless visual style. The original score by Randy Edelman is excellent. It knows when to be playful and cartoonish, when to be warm and romantic, and when to support the action without overwhelming it. But it's perhaps the use of specific musical performances in the film that is most memorable. The big dance sequences, in particular, are built around wonderful, energetic musical choices that perfectly suit the chaos and joy of what's happening on screen. Music and image work together in The Mask in a way that is seamlessly integrated, and the result is some sequences that feel genuinely like watching a musical number, even when they're officially just action comedy scenes. The dance sequence at the Coco Bongo is worth lingering on a little longer because it's genuinely one of the great comedic set pieces in 1990s cinema, and it represents such a perfect fusion of performance, effects, music, choreography, and direction. When the Mask enters the nightclub and immediately commandeers the stage, demanding the band play something with which he can use to woo Tina, and then proceeds to transform the entire nightclub into his personal performance space with increasingly impossible feats of dancing and spinning and general physical impossibility. It's just a joy. Pure, uncut, concentrated cinematic joy. There's a reason this sequence is one of the things people most often remember about the film decades later. It's the moment where everything that The Mask is trying to do comes together absolutely perfectly. The romance, the comedy, the spectacle, the character work, the effects, the music, all of it at once, all of it at full power, all of it working in perfect harmony. It's a remarkable piece of filmmaking, and it still gives you the same feeling on the 20th viewing that it did on the first. Let's take a step back and think about what The Mask meant in the context of 1994, because it's worth placing the film in its moment to fully appreciate what it was doing and why it landed the way it did. 1994 was an extraordinary year for movies. It gave us Forrest Gump, Pulp Fiction, The Shawshank Redemption, Speed, Interview with the Vampire, Natural Born Killers, and many others. It was a year when Hollywood was producing genuinely adventurous, wildly varied work across multiple genres. Into this rich landscape came The Mask, and it immediately distinguished itself as something quite special, a film that was doing things visually and comedically that had simply never been done before in quite this way. The response from audiences was enormous. The film was a massive box office success, eventually grossing over $350 million worldwide against a production budget that was significant but not astronomical, making it one of the most successful films of the year. And the critical response was warm. Reviewers recognized that they were watching something genuinely original, even if not everyone quite knew how to categorize it. But beyond the numbers and the reviews, The Mask did something important for the careers of everyone involved. For Jim Carrey, it was one of 3 films released in 1994, along with Ace Ventura and Dumb and Dumber, that collectively established him as the biggest comedy star of his generation and one of the most commercially reliable actors in Hollywood. It's remarkable, really, to think about what that year meant for his career. 3 massively successful films, 3 wildly different characters, 3 demonstrations of the sheer range and energy of his comedic talent. The Mask might be the most technically impressive of the 3 because it required him to do things physically and expressively that Ace Ventura and Lloyd Christmas didn't ask of him. For Cameron Diaz, of course, it was the beginning of everything, the launching pad for a career that would span decades and include some truly remarkable work. For Chuck Russell, it was a significant commercial and creative achievement that demonstrated his range as a director beyond genre fare. And for the visual effects industry, The Mask was a benchmark. a demonstration of what could be achieved when CGI was used thoughtfully and imaginatively rather than just as a spectacle for its own sake. Now, thinking about the film's legacy, it's worth noting that The Mask has endured in a way that many films from its era simply haven't. Part of this is Jim Carrey's performance, which is so extreme and so perfectly executed that it functions as a kind of time capsule of a very particular kind of comedic energy that was unique to him in that moment of his career. Part of it is the visual effects work, which holds up better than you might expect precisely because it was so grounded in a clear artistic vision rather than just technical capacity. Part of it is the emotional core of the story, which is genuinely timeless. The story of a gentle, overlooked person discovering that they have more inside them than the world has acknowledged is one that never stops resonating. And part of it is simply that it's an incredibly fun movie that makes people happy when they watch it, and movies that reliably make people happy tend to find their way back into regular circulation across the years. The Mask also spawned a sequel, Son of the Mask, in 2005, which we should probably mention if only to acknowledge that it exists and then move swiftly on, because it was not received warmly and bears very little resemblance to what made the original so special. Jim Carrey did not return for the sequel, which should tell you everything you need to know about what anyone involved thought of the creative direction it was taking. It's one of those cases where the original was so dependent on a very specific combination of elements, the script, the director, the effects work, and above all, Carrey's performance, that removing any of those elements left something that felt fundamentally hollow. The original The Mask is not the kind of film you can replicate by simply keeping the costume and finding someone else to wear it. The performance is the film, in a very real sense. Let me also spend some time on the film's humor, because it operates on several different levels simultaneously, and that multi-layer quality is part of why it has such broad appeal. At the most obvious level, The Mask is very funny in a purely visual, physical, slapstick way. The cartoon effects are inherently comedic. The sight of a green-faced man spinning through the air is funny, and Jim Carrey's extreme physical expressiveness is funny in an almost primal, immediate way that doesn't require any cultural knowledge or linguistic comprehension to appreciate. This level of humor gives the film genuine international accessibility and is a big part of why it was successful in so many different markets. But there's a second level of humor in the film that is more specifically cultural, built around references to classic Hollywood cinema, to specific American pop culture touchstones, and to the tradition of theatrical comedy going back to vaudeville and the great clowns of the early 20th century. The Mask's constant self-awareness, his tendency to break the fourth wall or reference his own situation, his habit of cycling through different celebrity impressions and movie star personas, all of this operates at a register that rewards viewers who are plugged into a particular cultural tradition. And then there's a third level, which is the humor that comes from character and situation, the comedy that arises from who these people are and how they react to what's happening to them. This is the level that Riegert's Kellaway mostly operates at, and it's the level that gives the film its longevity, because good character comedy doesn't date the way topical or reference humor. Let's also think about the film's relationship to the superhero genre, because The Mask is in many ways a superhero origin story, just told through a very specific comedic lens. It has all the structural elements of the superhero narrative: the ordinary person who acquires extraordinary abilities, the sense of wonder and then responsibility that comes with those abilities, the romance complicated by the secret identity, the villain who wants to weaponize the same power, the climactic confrontation, but it uses those elements in service of a story that is more interested in joy and comedy than in heroics or mythology. In this sense, The Mask is an interesting historical artifact in the evolution of the superhero film, made at a time before the MCU and the DCEU had established the dominant template for what superhero stories look like on screen. It represents a road not taken, a way of telling these stories that prioritized fun and character over epic stakes and dramatic gravity. There's an argument to be made that the superhero genre could have gone more in the direction of The Mask and been none the worse for it. That the combination of wish fulfillment, character comedy, romance, and spectacular action that The Mask achieves is actually a more sustainable and more broadly appealing model than the grimly earnest approach that has come to dominate the genre. But that's a conversation for another video. What is worth noting here is that The Mask does the superhero thing with a lightness of touch that is genuinely rare. It never takes itself too seriously, but it also never becomes purely self-mocking or cynical. It commits to its premise with total sincerity, even while being completely aware that its premise is absurd, and that combination of commitment and self-awareness is very difficult to achieve and very effective when you manage it. Stanley Ipkiss genuinely wants to be a better version of himself, genuinely falls in love, genuinely faces real stakes. And the film respects those genuine emotional investments even while surrounding them with tornado spins and cartoon mallets. That tonal balance is one of the great achievements of the production. Now, you might be wondering at this point whether there are any weaknesses to the film, because I've been pretty consistently enthusiastic so far, and it's fair to ask. And the honest answer is that yes, there are elements of The Mask that are less strong than others. The screenplay's middle section, for instance, while fun, occasionally loses focus. There are moments where the various plot threads feel slightly disconnected from each other, and the film's momentum dips a little in places. Peggy Brandt's arc, while well played by Amy Yasbeck, is not as fully developed as it could be, and her narrative function feels slightly mechanical at times. The film's resolution of certain plot threads is also a little expedient. Some things are wrapped up more quickly than they perhaps deserve to be. And there are a few moments where the effects work, while generally excellent, shows its age in ways that the best sequences don't. But these are genuinely minor criticisms of a film that, on the whole, is remarkably well crafted and genuinely excellent. The weaknesses are real, but they're dwarfed by the strengths, and they don't significantly detract from the overall experience of watching the film. The Mask is also interesting from a technical standpoint in terms of how it was edited, and it's worth spending a moment on this because editing comedy is genuinely one of the most difficult and underappreciated skills in filmmaking. Comedy lives and dies in the cut. A joke that lands in one version of a scene might completely die if you hold it a half second too long or cut away too early. The editing of The Mask by Arthur Coburn is excellent. It has a rhythmic quality that serves the comedy without calling attention to itself, and the decisions about when to hold on a reaction and when to cut are consistently right. The timing of the effect sequences in particular required extremely precise editing, because the cartoon physics only work if they happen at exactly the right moment in the rhythm of the scene. The editing is one of those craft elements that most viewers won't consciously notice, but that they would absolutely feel the absence of if it weren't done this well. Let's talk about what The Mask means for audiences watching it today, because I think it occupies an interesting position for different generations of viewers. For people who grew up with the film, who saw it in theaters in 1994 or caught it on video shortly thereafter, and became devoted fans during childhood or adolescence, there's an enormous amount of nostalgia involved in returning to it. But the remarkable thing is that the film actually holds up to that nostalgia rather than just coasting on it. Unlike some beloved childhood films that turn out to be somewhat less impressive when you revisit them with adult eyes, The Mask genuinely rewards mature viewing. The performances are better than you remember, the effects work is more sophisticated than you remember, and the emotional and thematic content of the film is more interesting and more meaningful than you might have registered when you were 9 years old and mostly just thrilled by the spinning and the cartoon faces. The film works on levels that children don't fully access, which is a sign of real quality in a family-oriented film. For younger viewers coming to the film for the first time, whether that's teenagers or even younger children in the present day, The Mask still works as pure entertainment, even though it's now 30 years old. The core comedic energy is not dated in any significant way. Jim Carrey's performance doesn't feel like a period piece. It feels like something genuinely unique that just happens to have been created 30 years ago. The effects work, while clearly of its time in certain respects, has a charm and a handcrafted quality that actually plays rather well in an era of increasingly sterile digital effects. And the story itself, as we've discussed, is built around feelings and desires that are completely universal. The result is a film that can be discovered for the first time by someone watching it in 2024 and still feel fresh and alive and genuinely special. There's a lot to say about how the film handles its comedic set pieces, and we've touched on some of them, but let me spend a moment on the variety of comedic approaches on display, because The Mask is actually quite adventurous in how many different types of comedy it incorporates. There's the pure physical slapstick of the cartoon effect sequences. There's the character-based comedy of Stanley's long-suffering interactions with his world before he finds the mask. There's the romantic comedy of his relationship with Tina. There's the satirical comedy of Kellaway's procedural detective work bumping up against completely impossible circumstances. There's the parody and reference humor of the mask's various impressions, sequences, and cultural citations. There's the absurdist comedy of certain sequences that are just so committed to their own internal logic that they become funny in a uniquely surreal way. And there's even, occasionally, a kind of meta-comedy where the film is aware of itself as a film and winks at the audience about it. Juggling all of these different comedic registers in a single film without any of them feeling out of place or tonally inconsistent is a real achievement, and it speaks to the skill of everyone involved in making The Mask that they pull it off as consistently as they do. One more thing that's really worth discussing before we head toward the wrap-up, and that's the film's cultural impact and its place in the legacy of 1990s comedy specifically. The Mask came out in a period when comedy in Hollywood was doing some genuinely interesting and adventurous things. Before the more formulaic comedy era of the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was a moment in the mid-1990s when comedies were being made with real creative ambition and real visual invention, and The Mask is one of the best examples of that moment. It influenced a lot of what came after it in terms of how effects-heavy comedy sequences could be conceived and executed. It demonstrated that you could spend serious money on effects in a comedy context and have audiences respond enthusiastically. And it helped establish Jim Carrey as a template for a certain kind of elastic, physically extreme comedy performance that influenced a generation of comedy performers. The Mask is not just a great film on its own terms, it's a historically significant film in the context of what it did for the industry and the art form. Looking at the film's script one more time, there's a particular quality to Mike Werb's writing that deserves acknowledgement. And that's the way it handles exposition and world building without ever being clunky or boring about it. The rules of The Mask, what it does, how it works, what its limitations are, where it comes from, are all established in ways that feel natural and integrated into the story rather than being delivered in obvious expository chunks. The library scene, for instance, where Stanley researches the mask's mythology, is handled with a light touch that gives you the information you need while also being genuinely entertaining, partly because it gives Jim Carrey something fun to do in an otherwise expository scene. This kind of graceful exposition is much harder to write than it looks, and it's one of the things that makes the screenplay of The Mask considerably better than a lot of people give it credit for. The film also does something quite clever in how it uses the Coco Bongo nightclub as a recurring location. It's the place where Stanley first sees Tina. It's the site of The Mask's most spectacular sequence. It's Dorian's base of operations, and it's where the climax of the film takes place. By repeatedly returning to this single location throughout the film, the screenplay creates a sense of all the various plot threads converging toward the same point, and it gives the location itself a weight and significance that makes the final sequence feel earned. Good screenwriting is often about choosing the right locations and making meaningful use of them, and the Coco Bongo is an excellent example of this principle. So, where does all of this leave us? After everything we've been through, the characters, the performances, the production, the effects, the comedy, the themes, the historical context, the technical craft, what is The Mask, ultimately? I think it's a film that operates at a very specific level of filmmaking excellence that is genuinely rare. It's a crowd pleaser that is also, on close examination, a carefully made and deeply considered piece of work. It's a comedy that is also, in its quieter moments, genuinely moving. It's a spectacular effects showcase that is also, at its core, a story about a fundamentally decent person finding the courage to be fully and joyfully themselves. It's a star-making vehicle that is also, beyond the star power, a well-written and well-directed film that would be entertaining even if someone else were in the lead role, which is not something you can say about every star vehicle. And it's a 1994 movie that, 30 years later, still makes people laugh and smile and feel good about watching it, which is ultimately the only test that really matters for a comedy. The Mask earned its place in the cultural canon, and it has held on to that place for 3 decades because it actually deserves it. Not every beloved film from our childhoods or our parents' childhoods can survive the scrutiny of a genuinely careful adult rewatch. But The Mask can, and does, and continues to. It's a movie that gives you more the more you bring to it, while also being completely satisfying if all you want to do is watch Jim Carrey be absolutely insane in a green face for about 100 minutes. That dual quality, the ability to reward deep engagement while also working perfectly as pure escapist entertainment, is the hallmark of a genuinely great popular film, and The Mask is exactly that. So if you haven't watched it recently, seriously, go watch it tonight. You're welcome in advance. And if you grew up with it and haven't revisited it as an adult, do yourself that favor. You'll discover a film that is even better than you remember, with layers and craft and performances that you couldn't fully appreciate the first time around. The Mask is 30 years old, and it is, in the best possible sense, absolutely timeless. That spinning green tornado of joy and chaos and heart is never going out of style, and honestly, the world is better for it. Anyway, that's everything I've got on The Mask for today. Hopefully that gave you some new angles on a film you thought you already knew, or got you excited to discover it for the very first time. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know what your favorite scene is, what your favorite Mask moment is, whether you think the effects still hold up. All of it. I want to hear it. Hit the like button if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of deep dive content, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care, everyone. Actually, wait. Before I let you go, because I realize I've been talking for a while and you're probably wondering if I'm ever going to stop. There are still some things about the mask that I genuinely haven't given enough credit to, and it would feel wrong to wrap this up without getting into them properly. So bear with me just a little longer, because this stuff is worth it. Let's talk about something that doesn't come up enough in conversations about this film, and that's the sound design. Now I know, sound design is not exactly the most glamorous topic when you're talking about a movie with cartoon tornadoes and spinning green faces. But the sound work in The Mask is genuinely extraordinary, and it's doing an enormous amount of work that you register completely unconsciously while you're watching the film. Every single one of The Mask's cartoon physical gags has a corresponding sound effect that is pulled directly from the vocabulary of classic animation. The spring-loaded bowing when his eyes pop out, the thunderous crash when his jaw hits the floor, the whirring of an engine when his legs spin up to impossible speed before he launches forward. These sounds are not accidents. They were carefully chosen and precisely timed to reinforce the visual comedy in exactly the same way that sound effects work in a Looney Tunes cartoon. And the fact that they land so perfectly is the result of incredibly skilled and thoughtful sound editing. The film is essentially translating the audio language of classic animation into a live-action context, and it does so with such confidence and such precision that it feels completely natural. You don't think about how weird it is that a real human being is making cartoon sounds. You just accept it and laugh, because the sound design has done its job perfectly. And while we're on the subject of things that don't get talked about enough, can we please take a moment to appreciate the costume design? Because The Mask's iconic look, the oversized yellow suit, the ridiculous wide-brimmed hat, the bright red tie, is one of the great costume design achievements in 1990s cinema, and it's doing a lot more than just looking funny. The yellow suit is important because it's the visual opposite of everything Stanley Ipkiss wears. Stanley's wardrobe is all muted colors, safe choices, clothes that help him blend in rather than stand out. His whole sartorial philosophy, if he has one, is about not being noticed. The masked suit is about being impossible to ignore. It's the loudest garment imaginable, a walking declaration of presence that says, "I am here, and I am not going anywhere, and you are absolutely going to notice me." The costume is character development, essentially. It's telling you everything you need to know about the difference between Stanley's suppressed self and his fully expressed self in a single visual statement. That's good design doing real narrative work, and it deserves to be recognized as such. The hat, specifically, is also worth a word, because the mask's relationship with his hat is one of the funniest recurring elements in the film. He's very attached to it. He uses it as a prop in his various performances. He produces things from it. He tips it with exactly the right degree of theatrical flair for every occasion. A lesser comedian would have just worn the hat as part of the costume and left it there. Jim Carrey turns it into a character in its own right, a collaborator in the comedy, and that's the kind of creative instinct you simply cannot teach. It comes from a deep understanding of physical comedy and an absolute commitment to finding humor in every element of every scene, no matter how small. Something else I want to circle back to is the mythology of the mask itself, because the film actually engages with this more thoughtfully than you might remember. The connection to Loki and the Norse trickster tradition isn't just window dressing. It's a genuine piece of thematic architecture that enriches the whole story when you sit with it. Loki in Norse mythology is fascinating because he's not simply a villain or a chaos agent. He's a complicated figure who creates problems but also solves them, who disrupts order but also creates new possibilities through that disruption. He's a catalyst, And that's exactly what the mask is in the film. A catalyst that disrupts the established order of Stanley's carefully controlled, carefully small existence, and creates the conditions for something new and better to emerge from the chaos. The mask doesn't make Stanley's life easier. It actually makes it considerably more complicated in the short term. But it forces him into situations and relationships and self-discoveries that his normal life would never have allowed for. It's the trickster function in mythological terms, disruption as a path to growth. And the film earns its happy ending precisely because it honors that function. Stanley doesn't just get the girl and live happily ever after because a magic artifact gave him superpowers. He gets the happy ending because the chaos of the mask experience forced him to discover what he actually wanted and to find the courage to pursue. That's a real character arc, built on a real mythological foundation, and it's more sophisticated than the film usually gets credit for being. Now let's talk about the Coco Bongo in a little more detail, because I mentioned it briefly before, but I think it genuinely deserves its own extended discussion as a piece of world building. The Coco Bongo is the kind of nightclub that only exists in movies. Impossibly glamorous, impossibly large, packed with the most beautiful and interesting people in the city, bathed in perfect golden light, featuring live music that always seems to be exactly the right song for the moment. It's not a realistic depiction of a real nightclub, and it's not trying to be. It's a fantasy version of a nightclub, a place that represents everything Stanley wants but feels excluded from: excitement, beauty, connection, the sense that life can be extraordinary rather than just ordinary. When he walks in there for the first time and sees Tina singing on stage, the camera treats it like a religious experience because for Stanley, it effectively is one. He's seeing something that represents a whole world of possibility that he doesn't know how to access, and the longing in Carrey's performance in that moment is genuinely beautiful and a little heartbreaking. And then, when the mask crashes the same venue later and takes it over completely, commandeers the stage, transforms the whole space, makes himself the center of everything, it's cathartic in the most satisfying possible way. The place that excluded Stanley has been conquered, comprehensively and hilariously, by the version of Stanley that refused to be excluded. There's a real emotional logic to that, and it's what gives the sequence weight beyond just the spectacular choreography. Let's pivot for a second to talk about the film's humor in relation to its era, because there's a specific flavor of 1990s comedy that The Mask exemplifies in a particularly pure form, and it's worth understanding what that means. The early to mid-1990s was a moment when a certain type of extremely high-energy, physically extreme, referentially promiscuous comedy was at its cultural peak. This was the era of In Living Color, which Jim Carrey came from, where comedic performance was about commitment and extremity and the willingness to go absolutely as far as a bit required and then keep going a little further. It was an aesthetic that prized excess as a virtue. The more, the bigger, the louder, the more physically committed, the better. The Mask is the purest cinematic expression of this comedic philosophy ever produced, because it takes those aesthetic values and builds them into the actual premise of the film. The Mask character isn't just doing a lot. He's literally incapable of doing anything halfway. He's constitutionally unable to be quiet or restrained or moderate. And that makes perfect sense as a character choice because it's an externalization of an aesthetic and a comedic philosophy that Carrey had been developing his whole career. The character is, in some meaningful sense, a portrait of what it looks like to be Jim Carrey at full power. And that's a remarkable thing to have captured on film. There's also something worth saying about how the film handles the balance between Stanley and the Mask as two aspects of the same character. A lesser film might have treated them as essentially separate entities. The mask is a kind of other personality that takes over and does things Stanley wouldn't do, with Stanley returning like someone waking up from a dream. But the mask is smarter than that. It makes clear throughout that the mask is not someone else. He's Stanley, running without restrictions. When the mask falls for Tina, it's Stanley falling for Tina. When the mask dances and performs and shows off, it's Stanley's suppressed joy and love of music and desire for connection expressing itself. The continuity between the two states is what makes the emotional arc of the film work, because it means that what happens as the mask matters for Stanley, and what Stanley wants matters even when the mask is in control. They're not two characters in one body. They're one character at two different volume settings. And that distinction is crucial for why the film's ending lands with genuine emotional satisfaction rather than feeling arbitrary or unearned. You know what else is really underrated about this film? The way it uses sound and music to establish mood in Stanley's pre-mask scene. When we're following Stanley through his daily routine, getting walked over at work, having his terrible landlady barge in, watching his car get towed, the film uses a very specific musical register that is warm but slightly melancholy, playful but tinged with the low-grade sadness of a life that isn't quite what it should be. It's not depressing. The film is too affectionate towards Stanley for that. But it has a quality of gentle yearning that makes you root for him immediately. And then, when the mask enters the picture, the music shifts gears completely, becoming big and brassy and exuberant in a way that mirrors the transformation of the character. Randy Edelman's score is doing sophisticated emotional work in these transitions, and it does it so smoothly that most viewers won't consciously notice the shift. They'll just feel the change in energy and respond to it accordingly. Good film scoring works exactly like this. It guides your emotional response without you being aware that it's guiding you. And the mask's score is a textbook example of that principle in action. Speaking of things that guide your emotional response without you noticing, let's talk about editing rhythm in the comedy sequences, and specifically about how the film calibrates the timing of its gags at a micro level. Comedy editing is one of those crafts that is almost completely invisible when done well and absolutely glaring when done badly. The Mask is edited with a very keen sense of comedic rhythm, particularly in the big physical comedy sequences. There's a specific tempo to how the film lands its gags, a moment of setup, a brief pause that creates just enough anticipation, the payoff, and then a quick cut before you have time to overthink what you just saw. This rhythm is consistent throughout the film, and it creates a kind of comedic momentum that keeps you laughing even in moments that might not be the film's strongest material, just because the pacing is carrying you along. It's the cinematic equivalent of a comedian who has such good timing that even their average jokes land better than they should. The machinery of the editing is working in your favor, even when individual components might not be at their absolute best. Let's also take a moment to think about what the film says about the nature of masks in a broader social sense, because I think there's a reading of this film that goes deeper than just the literal magical artifact and touches on something genuinely universal about how human beings present themselves to the world. We all wear masks in the metaphorical sense. We have versions of ourselves we perform for different audiences: the professional self, the social self, the family self, the self we are alone at home. Most of us have learned through experience which version of ourselves is acceptable in which context, and we've learned to keep the more unruly, more expressive, more fully alive versions of ourselves locked away for appropriate occasions, or sometimes for no occasions at all. Stanley Ipkiss has taken this to an extreme. He's suppressed so much of himself for so long that even the appropriate occasions for self-expression have disappeared from his life. And the mask, fantastical as it is essentially a device for exploring what happens when those suppressed selves get to come out and play without restriction. Every person watching the film has some version of Stanley's experience, some version of the thing they wish they could say or do or be if the social consequences could be temporarily suspended. The Mask gives you that fantasy, and then, more importantly, suggests that you don't actually need the magical artifact, that the courage to be your fuller self is something you can find without supernatural assistance. That's a quietly powerful message delivered in the most entertainingly chaotic possible packaging. And on the subject of the fantasy element, let's talk about the Mask as a wish fulfillment device, because the Mask is a genuinely masterful wish fulfillment fantasy in the tradition of the best wish fulfillment stories. Good wish fulfillment storytelling, and it's harder to do well than it sounds, takes something that everyone secretly wants and dramatizes it in a way that is both exhilarating and honest about the complications that come with getting what you want. The Mask gives Stanley everything he thinks he wants: power, confidence, the ability to command any situation, the freedom from social anxiety and self-consciousness. And it's genuinely exhilarating to watch him have all of that. But the film is also honest about the complications. The Mask draws attention that Stanley doesn't know how to handle. It creates a persona that is separate from Stanley in ways that complicate his relationship with Tina. It puts him in danger he's not equipped to navigate. And ultimately, the film's point is that the things Stanley actually needs, connection, love, the respect of being seen for who he actually is, are not things the Mask can give him. Those things require him to be Stanley, without the green face and the yellow suit. The wish fulfillment fantasy is complete and satisfying, but it's also honest, and that honesty is what elevates it beyond simple escapism. Now, I want to spend a little time on something that I find genuinely fascinating about this film from a filmmaking strategy perspective, and that's the decision to keep the Mask's powers relatively undefined. The film establishes very clearly what the Mask does in a general sense. It amplifies personality traits. It enables cartoon physics. It makes the wearer essentially unstoppable. But it never gives you a precise rule book for what the Mask can and can't do. And this is a really smart creative choice, because it means the film can give you whatever gag or plot development it needs without having to worry about violating established internal rules. The Mask can produce literally anything from anywhere: a weapon, a musical instrument, a giant mallet, a bouquet of flowers, because the rule is simply that it can produce whatever the comedic moment requires. This kind of flexible superpower is harder to write around than it might seem, because you have to be careful not to use the unlimited power to solve problems so easily that there's no tension left. The Mask handles this elegantly by keeping the emotional stakes, the relationship with Tina, the question of what kind of person Stanley is going to be, separate from the physical stakes, so the Mask's unlimited power doesn't trivialize the things that actually matter in the story. There's a particular scene that I think beautifully illustrates the film's tonal sophistication, and it's one that sometimes gets overlooked because it's relatively quiet and brief compared to the film's bigger set pieces. It's the moment early in the film when Stanley has just discovered the Mask and is experimenting with it alone in his apartment, and Milo is watching him with complete, unruffled dog acceptance. The scene is funny. Of course it is, because Carrey is doing extraordinary things with his face and body. But it's also strangely tender, because you're watching someone discover, in the privacy of their own home with only their dog as witness, that they are capable of more than they thought. The Mask has given Stanley access to a version of himself that he didn't know existed, and even in this initial exploratory moment, you can see the wonder and delight in his reaction. Carrey plays this with a beautiful combination of physical extremism and genuine emotional warmth. And it's one of those scenes that tells you everything about who Stanley is and why you should care about what happens to him. It's not the biggest scene in the film, but it might be the most important one. Let's circle around to talking about Edge City as a setting one more time, because I don't think we fully appreciated it the first time through. Edge City is a brilliant piece of world building because it's simultaneously completely generic and completely specific. It's generic in the sense that it could be any mid-sized American city. It has all the standard urban landmarks and textures that signify cityness in the American cinematic imagination. But it's specific in the sense that it has a very particular atmosphere, a particular quality of light and energy that marks it as belonging to this film and this story. The production design team created a city that feels lived in and real, while also being subtly stylized in ways that prepare you for the film's more fantastical elements. And importantly, Edge City is the right scale for the story being told. It's not so big that Stanley gets lost in it, but it's not so small that his adventures feel parochial. It's a city where one person with a magical mask can make a significant impact without straining credibility, which is exactly what the story needs. One last thing I want to highlight before we really truly wrap up is the film's final act and how well it brings everything together. The climax of The Mask is set, as we discussed, at the Coco Bongo, and it's a sequence that has to simultaneously deliver on several different fronts. It has to be spectacular and exciting as action. It has to be funny as comedy. It has to be emotionally satisfying as the conclusion of Stanley and Tina's relationship arc, and it has to resolve the threat posed by Dorian in a way that feels appropriate for the film's tone. That's a lot to accomplish at once, and the film accomplishes all of it. The sequence is inventive and energetic, building on everything that has come before while also escalating in ways that feel genuinely surprising. The emotional beats land correctly, and the resolution of the Stanley-Tina relationship feels earned rather than automatic. And the way the film handles the mask in the final sequence is thematically resonant. What happens with the mask at the end of the film is a direct expression of the themes about identity and authenticity that the whole story has been building toward. The very end of the film, after the main action is resolved, gives us a brief coda that is genuinely lovely in its simplicity. Stanley and Tina together, Stanley being exactly himself, nervous and warm and kind and present, and it being completely enough. The mask is gone. Stanley doesn't need it. And the film ends on that note of quiet affirmation, that who you actually are, underneath all the noise and the fear and the performance, is sufficient, is more than sufficient, is exactly right. It's a beautiful landing for a film that has been doing so much, so loudly, so brilliantly, for the previous 90-odd minutes, and it works precisely because the film has done the work to earn it. You know, 30 years on, The Mask still feels like a miracle of a movie, one of those productions where everything came together in exactly the right way at exactly the right moment, creating something that is more than the sum of its parts. Jim Carrey was at his most explosively creative. Cameron Diaz was discovering her extraordinary gifts. The effects technology was at precisely the right stage of development to realize the film's vision. The writing was smart and warm, the direction was confident and inventive, and the result was something that audiences recognized immediately as special, and that time has only confirmed as a genuine classic. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because talented people, given the right material and the right conditions, can occasionally make something that transcends what any of them could have predicted. The Mask is exactly that kind of happy accident, except that when you look closely at it, it's actually not very accidental at all. It's the result of a lot of skill and care and creative commitment. It just feels like magic because the best movies always do. All right, that's genuinely all I've got. And yeah, I know I said that like 20 minutes ago and then kept going, but this time I really mean it. If you made it all the way to the end of this, you are an absolute legend, and I genuinely appreciate you spending this much time on a deep dive into a 30-year-old comedy film with me. There's no greater compliment a viewer can pay a creator than their time and attention, and I don't take that lightly. The Mask deserves every minute of serious attention anyone gives it, and I hope this video helped you see why. Now seriously, go watch the movie, or re-watch it. And next time you see that spinning green tornado, just appreciate how much craft and love went into creating it. See you in the next one. Okay, but actually, real talk. I keep saying I'm done and then finding more things worth saying, which probably tells you something about how rich this film actually is as a subject. Because here's the thing about The Mask that I haven't fully addressed yet, and it's been sitting in the back of my mind this whole time. The movie is genuinely revolutionary in ways that the broader film conversation has never quite given it credit for. And I think part of the reason for that is the comedy bias. Serious film criticism has always had a slightly uncomfortable relationship with comedy as a genre, treating it as somehow less worthy of deep analysis than drama or action or science fiction. But when you actually sit down and examine what The Mask is doing technically and artistically, you realize you're looking at a film that pushed boundaries in multiple directions simultaneously, and that deserves to be talked about with the same level of seriousness we'd bring to any other landmark film of its era. Let me give you a specific example of what I mean. The way The Mask integrates its CGI effects with practical performance is something that filmmakers and effects supervisors still study today, and for good reason. In 1994, the tools for doing what the film does were brand new. We're talking about technology that had only really started to prove itself in the previous 2 or 3 years, primarily through films like Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park. But those films were using CGI primarily to create things, creatures, robots, machines, that were separate from the human performers. What The Mask did was fundamentally different and fundamentally harder. It used CGI to transform a human performance in real time, to take what Jim Carrey was doing with his body and his face and extend it beyond the physical limits of what a human body can do. The challenge there is enormous, because the audience is watching a real person the whole time, and the transition between what is real and what is digitally enhanced has to be invisible, or at least seamless enough that the comedy works. And the effects team pulled it off brilliantly, creating a pipeline for integrating performer and digital enhancement that influenced how this kind of work was approached for years afterward. What's also fascinating from a technical standpoint is how much of the film's most spectacular comedy is actually achieved through practical means rather than digital ones. A lot of people assume that everything The Mask does is CGI, but that's not the case at all. A significant portion of the physical comedy, particularly the more contained gags that happen in enclosed spaces, is achieved through good old-fashioned practical effects, camera tricks, clever editing, and Jim Carrey's extraordinary physical control. The film's effects supervisor and director worked very carefully to figure out which gags required digital enhancement and which could be achieved more cheaply and more effectively through practical means. And the result is a film where the CGI and the practical effects are so well integrated that you genuinely cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. That level of seamlessness is a genuine technical achievement, and it's one of the reasons the film's effects work holds up better than a lot of pure CGI work from the same era. And speaking of Jim Carrey's physical control, Let's talk about this more specifically because I think it's something that gets taken for granted even by people who love his work in this film. What Carrey does in The Mask is not just mugging and flailing around. It's extremely precise, extremely disciplined physical performance that creates the illusion of total chaos through total control. Every movement he makes as the mask is calculated. The speed of a gesture, the angle of his body, the exact degree to which he commits to a particular physical extreme. The cartoon exaggeration of his performance is not accidental or random. It's the result of someone who has studied the language of physical comedy with the same dedication that a classical musician brings to studying an instrument, and who has developed the ability to deploy that language with extraordinary precision. When the mask's jaw drops to the floor, the comedy of that moment depends on Carrey's timing being exactly right, on the setup being clear, the pause being exactly long enough, and the follow-through being committed without being overdone. These are split-second decisions that happen in real time during performance, and Carrey makes them correctly over and over again throughout the film. That's not luck, that's mastery. It's also worth noting that the physical demands of this role were genuinely extreme in ways that go beyond the effect sequences. The amount of energy that Carrey expends in a single scene as the mask would exhaust most performers. He's operating at a physical intensity that few actors could sustain for any length of time, let alone across the multiple takes that film production requires. There are stories from the set about the level of physical preparation and recovery that went into maintaining that performance consistently across the shooting schedule, and it speaks to a level of professional dedication that often gets overlooked in favor of simply celebrating the results. The results are spectacular, yes, but they didn't emerge from nowhere. They're the product of enormous effort and commitment, and that effort deserves to be acknowledged. Now let me pivot to something a little different because I want to talk about the film's relationship with its audience in terms of the specific emotional journey it takes you on, and why that journey is so satisfying in a way that is actually somewhat unusual for comedies of this type. Most broad comedies are essentially flat in their emotional structure. They're designed to make you laugh consistently throughout, with a perfunctory emotional beat or two to give the story some shape, but without any real attempt to take you through a genuine emotional arc. The Mask is different from this in an interesting way. It actually does take you through a real emotional journey, structured with some care, that moves from sympathy, through excitement, through something approaching genuine tension, before arriving at satisfaction. And it does this while maintaining its comedic tone throughout, which is the really impressive part. The sympathy comes first. The film spends its early sequences building a Stanley Ipkiss that you genuinely care about, whose situation you understand, and whose frustrations you share. This is important because it means that when the mask arrives and everything changes, you're invested in what happens next, not just because the spectacle is fun, but because you actually care about this person. Then comes the excitement of discovery. The sequences where Stanley first experiments with the mask, where the mask makes his first forays into the world, are genuinely exhilarating to watch because they're so creative and so energetic, but they also carry an emotional charge because they're happening to someone you've been rooting for. Then the film introduces genuine complications. The threat from Dorian, the risk to Tina, the pressure from Kellaway, that create real stakes and a measure of actual tension. And then, the resolution provides genuine emotional satisfaction because it earns it through the work the film has done in establishing who these characters are and what they mean to each other. That's a complete and well-structured emotional arc, and it's the reason The Mask feels substantial and satisfying in a way that a lot of superficially similar films don't. Here's something that I think is genuinely underappreciated about the film, and that's how it handles the question of popularity and social validation. Stanley Ipkiss is, in many ways, a character defined by his invisibility, by the fact that the world around him consistently fails to see him, fails to recognize his value, treats him as background noise rather than a person worth paying attention to. And the mask, when he puts on the artifact, becomes the opposite. Someone who commands attention absolutely, who cannot be ignored, who is the center of every room he enters. The film is very clear that this attention comes with its own complications and is not simply an unambiguous good, but it's also honest about how seductive that visibility is, how deeply most people want to be seen and acknowledged and recognized, and how painful sustained invisibility actually is. There's a reason the film resonates so strongly with people who have felt overlooked or underestimated in their own lives, because Stanley's situation is genuinely relatable, and the fantasy of the mask is genuinely understandable. We've all had moments where we wished we could walk into a room and have it be immediately clear that we belong there, that we matter, that we are not someone to be dismissed. The mask gives Stanley that experience, and through Stanley it gives the audience that experience vicariously, and that vicarious wish fulfillment is part of what makes the film so enduringly popular. And then the film does something really smart with this theme in its conclusion, which is to suggest that the answer to the problem of invisibility is not to acquire supernatural powers of attention commanding. The answer is something much quieter and much harder. It's to actually believe yourself that you are worth being seen. Because Tina's affection for Stanley is not something that the mask earned through spectacular dancing or impossible feats. It's something that Stanley earned by being genuinely kind, genuinely warm, genuinely himself. Tina sees Stanley before she has any reason to be impressed by him. She's drawn to him in their early interactions because there's something real and good about him that registers even through all of his nervous, self-effacing behavior. And that's the film's actual message about visibility and recognition. You don't need to be spectacular to be worth seeing. You just need to be real, and to let the people who are worth your time actually see you. Now let's get into something really fun, which is the film's relationship to classic cartoon traditions and the specific visual references it's drawing on, because this is a rabbit hole that I find genuinely delightful. The mask is saturated with references to a very specific tradition of American animation, primarily the theatrical short cartoons of the Warner Brothers and MGM studios from roughly the 1930s through the 1960s. Directors like Tex Avery, Chuck Jones, and Bob Clampett created a visual language of physical comedy during that period that was unlike anything that had come before. A universe where the laws of physics were suggestions rather than rules, where characters could survive anything and recover instantly, where emotion was expressed through extreme physical transformation, where the body was infinitely elastic and infinitely expressive. The mask is essentially a love letter to this tradition, an attempt to translate that visual language into live action with all the technical tools of 1990s Hollywood at its disposal. The specific Tex Avery references in the film are particularly numerous and particularly gleeful. Avery was famous for a specific kind of gag involving a male character seeing an attractive woman and reacting with absolutely uncontrolled, physically impossible expressions of attraction. Eyes literally flying out of the head, jaw dropping to the floor, heart visibly pounding out of the chest. These gags appeared in dozens of Avery's cartoons and became one of the most recognizable visual signatures of classic American animation. When the mask reacts to Tina with exactly these gags, eyes popping, jaw dropping, heart bouncing, it's a direct and deliberate homage to Avery, delivered with full awareness of the reference and total commitment to executing it in live action as faithfully as possible. And it works brilliantly, because the underlying comedic principle of the gag is completely timeless. The comedy comes from an honest and universal experience, the experience of being completely overwhelmed by attraction, expressed through physical extremity that is funny precisely because it's so much more honest than how we actually behave in those moments. The cartoon tradition captured something real about human experience, and The Mask taps into that truth in the same way. The influence of Chuck Jones is also present throughout the film, particularly in the more intricate timing-based gags and in the specific way that The Mask plays with the audience's expectations. Jones was a master of the comedic pause, the moment where a character registers what's happening to them just a beat too late, creating comedy through the gap between event and reaction. You can see this influence in the way Carrey calibrates some of his more contained reactions as The Mask, and in the way certain gags are structured to build toward a punchline that arrives at exactly the right moment and no sooner. The film is doing sophisticated comedy construction that draws on decades of accumulated wisdom from the animation tradition, and part of what makes it so funny is that it's applying that wisdom in a context where audiences don't quite expect it. You know what else deserves attention? The way the film handles its daylight sequences versus its nighttime sequences, because there's a really interesting visual and thematic distinction being drawn there. Almost all of Stanley's pre-mask life happens during the day. We see him going to work in the morning light, navigating his daytime routine, existing in the ordinary world of offices and banks and streets. But The Mask almost exclusively operates at night, moving through a city lit by neon and streetlights and the warm golden glow of the Coco Bongo. This isn't accidental. The day belongs to Stanley's ordinary self, to the world of rules and work and social expectations that keep him small. The night is where the Mask's world lives, where different rules apply, where the city becomes something more mysterious and more alive. It's the classic distinction between the everyday world and the world of possibility, and the film maps it onto the day-night cycle in a way that is visually elegant and thematically coherent. The Mask doesn't just change who Stanley is, it changes what world he lives in, what kind of story he's in. And the film uses lighting and time of day to make that shift visible. Let's also talk about the film's relationship to the concept of performance itself, because there's a genuinely interesting meta-level to The Mask that has to do with what it means to perform. Jim Carrey is, in his daily life and career, someone whose identity as a performer is central to who he is. Someone for whom the line between performance and authentic self-expression has always been fluid and complicated. And he's playing a character who discovers that the fullest expression of his authentic self is essentially a performance, a big, theatrical, maximally expressive one. There's something genuinely interesting and potentially autobiographical in that setup, though of course you'd want to be careful about reading too much autobiography into any fictional performance. But it's hard not to notice the resonance between Stanley's experience of discovering that his most authentic self is also his most performative self, and the experience of a performer like Carrey, who has built a career and an identity around the idea that extreme performance is a form of authentic expression. The Mask, in this reading, is not something external to Stanley at all. It's the part of him that has always known exactly who he is and exactly how he wants to be in the world. It just needed the right context to come out. There's also something worth saying about the film's relationship to the idea of fun itself, what it means to have fun, what it looks like when someone is genuinely having the time of their life, and how rare it is to see that depicted on screen with real conviction. The Mask, when he's at full power, is clearly having the most fun of anyone who has ever existed. The joy is completely real and completely infectious. You can't watch him bouncing around the Coco Bongo or spinning through the streets of Edge City without catching some of that energy, without feeling some answering spark of delight in your... And this is partly Jim Carrey's gift as a performer, his ability to communicate genuine joy in a way that transfers directly to the audience. But it's also a function of how the character is written and how the film is directed. The Mask is never doing anything purely functional or mechanical. Everything he does with a kind of absolute creative investment, as if every moment is an opportunity for some new form of expression. And that investment is contagious. There's a school of thought in comedy theory that the funniest things are the things that feel most free, the gags that seem to come from a place of genuine creative play rather than calculated construction. The best comedy has an improvisational quality even when it's completely scripted and precisely executed, because the best comedy performers make you feel that they're discovering the joke in the moment rather than delivering a pre-planned punchline. Jim Carrey in The Mask is the ultimate expression of this principle in a live-action context. Even in the most elaborately planned and technically complicated sequences, he creates the impression of pure creative freedom, of someone who is making it up as they go and finding gold every single time. That's an incredibly sophisticated comedy skill, and it's at the heart of why his performance in this film is so extraordinary. I also want to take a moment to talk about the film's relationship with music on a level beyond just the score, because there's a broader musicality to The Mask that I think is worth exploring. The film moves with the rhythm and structure of a musical performance in a lot of ways. Sequences build like musical phrases. Gags arrive like beats in a song. The energy rises and falls in patterns that are closer to musical composition than to conventional film narrative. Chuck Russell's direction has a rhythmic quality that makes the film feel like it's being conducted rather than just edited. And Carrey's performance contributes to this by having an inherently musical quality. His timing is so precise and so intuitive that watching him is not unlike watching a jazz musician improvising within a structure. The way he varies his rhythm, the way he sits on a pause or rushes through a line, the way he syncopates his physical comedy against the dialogue, it's all deeply musical. And the Mask character's explicit love of jazz and performance is really just the surface manifestation of a deeper musicality that runs through the entire film. Stanley's love of jazz is actually a lovely character detail that does multiple things at once. It establishes him as someone with genuine aesthetic sensibility and passion, not just a generic sad sack character. It connects him to a tradition of American art that is about both technical mastery and creative freedom. Jazz is, after all, music that lives in the space between structure and improvisation, between the written composition and the spontaneous expression, which is exactly the space that Stanley himself inhabits as a character. It gives him and Tina a genuine point of connection beyond just physical attraction. And it provides a musical vocabulary for the film to draw on in some of its most important sequences. It's a small detail that carries a lot of weight, which is the hallmark of really good character writing. One more aspect of the film I haven't fully addressed is its geography and how the physical spaces of Edge City shape the story. We've talked about the Coco Bongo as a recurring location, but the film actually moves through a pretty rich variety of spaces throughout its running time, and each space has its own character and its own thematic significance. Stanley's apartment is small and slightly cluttered. It's a space that reflects its owner, full of personality but not quite living up to its potential. The bank where he works is clean and formal and utterly impersonal, a space designed to keep everyone in their lane. The park by the river where he finds the mask is liminal, neither fully urban nor fully natural, a transitional space that is appropriate for the transitional event that happens there. These spatial choices are not accidental, and reading the film's geography as a kind of thematic map gives you another layer of meaning to work with alongside the explicit narrative. Something I genuinely find interesting every time I rewatch The Mask is how the film manages the question of consequences, or rather, how it carefully manages the absence of serious consequences for the mask's more chaotic activities while still maintaining enough narrative tension to keep the story engaged. The Mask does a lot of things in his nocturnal adventures that, in a realistic context, would have very serious repercussions. He completely disrupts an entire neighborhood. He causes enormous property damage. He creates absolute chaos wherever he goes. And yet the film treats all of this as essentially consequence-free comedy, which is entirely appropriate given the tone and the cartoon logic of the Mask's world. But it does this without ever feeling irresponsible or tone-deaf. And the way it achieves that is by keeping the Mask's activities within a very specific register, chaotic and wild, but never actually causing harm to anyone who doesn't have it coming. The victims of the Mask's chaos are always either people who have wronged Stanley or property, rather than people. And this careful calibration allows the film to revel in consequence-free mayhem without ever making the audience feel uncomfortable about it. Now I realize I keep finding new angles on this film, and at some point that has to say something definitive, either about the film's richness or about my inability to stop talking. And honestly, it's probably both. But let me close out this particular thread with one final observation about what makes The Mask such a lasting achievement. Something that I think gets to the very core of why this movie has survived 30 years and kept finding new fans across generations. The best movies, regardless of genre, are the ones that understand what they're actually about and commit to that understanding completely and without compromise. The Mask knows exactly what it's about. It's about the gap between who we are and who we have the potential to be, about the fear that keeps us small and the joy that becomes available when we let go of that fear, about the way authentic human connection requires us to be our actual selves rather than a performance of safety and acceptability. It knows all of this, and every element of the film, the casting, the effects, the music, the design, the editing, the performances, is in service of communicating these ideas as vividly and as joyfully as possible. That alignment between what a film is about and how every element of the film serves that purpose is genuinely rare. And when it happens, the result is something that transcends its genre and its moment and becomes something more lasting, which is exactly what The Mask is. Not just a great comedy, not just a great effects showcase, not just a great star vehicle, but a genuinely great film that does genuinely important things with its premise and delivers them with a level of craft and commitment and sheer joyful energy that puts it in a category by itself. And if that sounds like high praise for a movie where a man in green face paint produces a giant mallet from his waistband, well, yeah, it is. And it's completely deserved. I think that's really truly everything now. And if you've stuck with me through this entire thing, from the very beginning all the way to here, then honestly, you're the kind of viewer that makes making content like this completely worth it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about movies and the craft that goes into them. And thank you for spending time thinking seriously about a film that deserves serious thought. Drop a comment, share this with someone who loves The Mask as much as we apparently do, and I will catch you next time with something else worth diving into. Later. This is a giant mallet from his waistband. Well, Yeah, it is. And it's completely deserved. I think that's really truly everything now. And if you've stuck with me through this entire thing, from the very beginning all the way to here, then honestly, you're the kind of viewer that makes making content like this completely worth it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about movies and the craft that goes into them. And thank you for spending time thinking seriously about a film that deserves serious thought. Drop a comment, share this with someone who loves The Mask as much as we apparently do, and I will catch you next time with something else worth diving into. Later.